Good morning, everybody. I called this press conference here today to kind of clarify a recent incident that we've investigated here in the Sheriff's Office. We received a complaint in reference to the treatment of one of our inmates that was here from DOC on a competency hearing. The complaint came in and it had no specific officer named or deputy named in the allegation. So what we did is we started an administrative inquiry to do some fact-finding into what was going on. Some of the allegations we were able to quickly address with regards to the inmate being forced to be nude. He wasn't forced to be nude, but basically he was put in what's called a suicide suit. It's a thick, heavy garment that's draped over their person that they can't use to hurt themselves. So the normal garment that they're given when they're brought into the jail is taken from them and they're put in this protective garment. As for the light fixtures that they talked about, well, at night when the lights are dimmed down in the other housing pods like they were in the, we couldn't do that in the infirmary because then we could not see with the cameras, and those on direct opt, we have to be able to view what they're doing. We have to be able to watch them because they're on direct opt for a reason. Also, we found there was an allegation with regards to the video visitation. Well, as everybody knows, we had recently changed our video visitation. And when the camera was set up in the portable unit, now we have a portable unit in certain housing pods where the inmates are not taken out of their cells and brought into the normal housing pod. So we wheel this to their cell. And what we found afterwards is when the new camera was installed, it was installed on a slight angle. So that angle basically faced the door lock and not the opening in the door where you can have that face-to-face visit. So that was also addressed. So we were able to quickly put those to rest, address those, and fix what we needed to. Actually, we were able to also do some adjustments to the cameras now where we're able to dim the lights and still the cameras will be able to pick up what's going on within the cells. Now, the more serious allegation of the inmate being forced to eat his own feces. After we reviewed some video, we had some concerns and we identified a potential subject officer. So at that time, the administrative inquiry was stopped because we had an identified deputy, and my chief deputy, Colonel Tom Rogers, made the decision to have our major crimes unit look into it for any potential criminal abuse of a mentally ill person. So our major crimes unit picked it up, they looked into it, they did some interviews, they went through the statutes, and they didn't find where a criminal statute met. So their case was then concluded, and then it was turned back over to the administrative, and an internal affairs investigation was opened up with the subject officer being that of Michael Burnett. And what we saw through video is that the inmate was brought into the housing pod, he was brought to his cell, he was standing there talking to deputies, receiving instructions of the pod, he was relatively calm, and then the door had closed, so he became irritated. We have conflicting stories of what was said or how it was said to really know what set him off. But what he did at that point is he went to the back of the cell where the toilet is. He dropped his pants, and you could see him take his hand and wipe his buttocks, and then he brings it to his face. There was nothing on his hand at that time that we can see. He's making some motions outside the cell, and then he goes back, he drops his pants again, and he wipes, and we can clearly see that there was fecal matter on his hand, and he presented it to the person standing at the window, and then he put it on his face. We matched up the cameras from inside the cell to the cameras outside the cell, and that's when we saw that Michael Burnett was the only deputy who was standing at that cell at the time, and at the exact second that he was doing this, Michael Burnett was looking in that window, and then it clearly showed him walking away from the cell, laughing. That is not tolerated here. As I told him during his pre-disciplinary hearing, the inmate population is solely here for our care, custody, and control, and not for our entertainment. So he was dealt with, he's been fired. Now, I know there's some confusion with regards to investigations. When you're dealing with an administrative investigation and a criminal investigation, they're two different things. And what we try and do is a criminal investigation will take precedence over the administrative. We try and run the criminal investigation first because an administrative investigation, there are laws that are outlined in statute that must be followed. And if they're not followed, the agency or the investigator who is running that administrative investigation, if they don't follow those rules to the T, they can be held liable, and they can also have charges brought up against them and their ticket potentially taken from them. So we have to follow that administrative investigation to the T. And the unions have pushed where it's very different from a criminal investigation. It basically outlines how we have to do an administrative investigation. And then the difference between an administrative and a criminal investigation, when you're dealing with the subject officer, you can bring them in under a criminal investigation, you read them their Miranda rights, and they have the opportunity to talk to you or exercise their right and not talk to you. In an administrative investigation, they're required to talk to the investigating officer, but under administrative, and that interview cannot be used in the criminal. So that's why we need to run them separately. And it's got to be clear that when that officer comes in, that they know that they're under an administrative interview and not a criminal interview. Another difference too is the way the statute is written out, which is somewhat frustrating because it does make it a little difficult to get rid of problem officers, is when you bring them in for an administrative interview, prior to that interview, they are allowed to read every statement and look at every piece of evidence you have before you do the interview. So they could potentially be putting their story together before that investigator has that chance to interview them. So we do try and do the criminals first because it takes precedence, but there's two separate investigations. And we've seen that here lately with a couple different cases that have been going on around the county. So with that, I will open it up to any additional questions you might have.
So was a criminal investigation done first on Mr. Burnett, or was it an administrative inquiry that was done first?
Well, first we did an administrative inquiry because it was general. We didn't have a focused officer. So we had to do some fact-finding to find out what was going on. Like I said, a lot of the allegations we were able to address rather quickly. And then when we came across the video and saw what had happened, that's when we stopped the administrative inquiry. We opened up a criminal, and they looked into it. When it was found that there were no criminal violations per Florida statute, that was closed, and then the internal affairs investigation was opened. So there's probably a confusion. We have what's called an administrative inquiry, and that's kind of a general investigation when there's really no focused officer. It's kind of fact-finding what's going on. And then an internal affairs investigation is done when you actually have an employee that you're focusing on.
And again, you did the criminal before you did the IA?
Yes, we did the criminal before we did the IA.
And in both instances, was Mr. Burnett given his Miranda rights, and was he questioned?
In the criminal case, he was given his Miranda rights, because that's what we do, and he was questioned. In the administrative inquiry, you don't give him Miranda, but you're giving him what's called their Garrity rights, and those were given to him under the administrative. Like I said, two separate rules, two separate guidelines.
So this officer had problems in the past, correct?
Yeah, a few years back we had an incident where he had basically what we called mule kicked the door. He stood up to his back to a door and he kicked the window where an inmate was sleeping on the other side. That was sustained. He was disciplined for it. He'd been through remedial training, and he actually started to improve. He was actually He did some of our CERT demonstrations to the different public. He did really well there. He was actually awarded our Deputy of the Quarter at one point, so he had made a turnaround, but then we had this incident, and it just can't be tolerated.
Now, Sheriff, could you describe the area where Mr. Kopczynski was being held? Was there a nurse at that station where he was?
Well, if you remember from the tour, it was in the C1 housing unit. That is our makeshift infirmary. It's a housing unit. He was in one of the cells. I believe it was one of the bottom cells, right? One of the bottom cells, and it does have a camera inside of them, so we can see, because those who are put on direct op are the ones with the cameras inside the cells. So he was in there.
Unit or the,
It was the infirmary, so yes.
Can they see what's going on?
Can they?
In all these cells?
Well, you can only basically see what's going on if you're right up to the cell or if you're watching the monitor where the cameras are behind it. And the nurses usually aren't behind the monitor. And what we do too, depending on the inmate, is we have covers that go over the windows, because some of them will decide not to wear these protective suits and they will run around naked. So we do respect their privacy, and we have coverings up so the other inmates and other staff can't gawk in, but we do have a camera, and there's always somebody who's watching that monitor to see what they're doing to make sure they're not harming themselves.
If there's always someone watching, how come you didn't see what this officer did in that instant? Why did it take so long to be able to find out who that was?
Well, we're addressing that too, because there were some things that were said, and there were other people within that pod, employees within that pod, who heard certain things, but they didn't act, and that's going to be addressed.
How many deputies, all other personnel were?
There were 3 other deputies in the housing unit. None of them were at the cell at the time this happened.
And all of them failed to
They failed to report.
report. Because of this, are there going to be any policy changes or anything like that that will be happening?
Actually, our policies are sound. It's that they weren't followed. So that will be addressed.
Sheriff, at what point, because you mentioned that he was brought in for a competency hearing,
Yes.
but he was also taken to the jail because he was filing post-conviction relief. In other words, challenging the sentencing that he got in 2013, 15 years. And are you aware that Mr. Kopczynski was a confidential informant for the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office?
Sir, I'm not going to speak about confidential informants. Any other questions?
Going back to those other officers, could there potentially be more terminations in the result of, I don't know if you call it another investigation or?
No, we're not looking at additional terminations on this case.
How did you first find out about it again?
A friend of Mr. Kopczynski had sent in a complaint to the sheriff's office, so she made the complaint to us based on what he was telling her during her visitations.
Okay.
The fact that no one talked, does that speak to a culture of the officers that are working at the jail?
No, I don't believe it's a culture. I believe this is one incident. We had several new individuals in there, and I think they were just kind of not sure what to do. But they're going to know what to do. Okay? All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.